50 of my relatives are coming from Ohio for Thanksgiving, Brittany announced, tossing a 3-page grocery list onto the marble kitchen island. The heavy paper slid across the smooth surface and stopped right next to my morning coffee. Start shopping, she commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the endless rows of expensive ingredients. My son Derek took a slow sip of his dark roast coffee, barely looking up from his smartphone screen. "Dad," he muttered, his voice completely devoid of any respect or warmth. "You will need to sleep on the air mattress in the garage for the week. Brittany parents are going to need your master suite so they can be comfortable." I looked at the two parasites currently occupying the home I had built from the ground up. I smiled, reached into my coat pocket, and dropped my heavy metal credit card right on top of her grocery list. "Perfect," I said, keeping my voice absolutely level and calm. "I am leaving. You two can cook, clean, and host 50 people all by yourselves. I am not your servant." Their smug smiles vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden look of sheer panic. They had no idea I had already permanently deactivated that card, nor did they have any clue about the massive surprise I had waiting for them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to ungrateful family members who severely underestimated your worth. I am William Harrison, 78 years old, and for more than 40 years I worked as a structural engineer across the state of Texas. I know exactly how to build foundations that can withstand hurricanes. And more importantly, I know exactly which supporting beam to remove to make an entire building collapse. Brittany scrambled around the large kitchen island, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She positioned her body directly between me and the front entryway, her face flushed with a sudden desperate anger. "You cannot just leave!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "Who is going to roast the 15-pound turkey? Who is going to pay for all the wine, the decorations, and the catering sides?" I looked at her carefully, analyzing her like a poorly constructed bridge. She was 28 years old, wearing designer clothes, bought entirely with my retirement money, standing in a luxury house maintained exclusively by my hard-earned pension. I simply adjusted my coat, feeling the satisfying weight of my real wallet in my inner pocket, and looked her dead in the eye. "That sounds like a major structural problem for the hosts," I replied smoothly. "And since I am apparently sleeping on a deflated piece of rubber next to a lawnmower in the garage, I am clearly not the host. Now excuse me." I stepped around her with deliberate slowness, moving with the careful, measured pace of an old man with aching joints. Derek finally dropped his phone, standing up so incredibly fast that his heavy wooden dining chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Dad, come on, stop being so dramatic," he called out, jogging a few steps toward the hallway. "Where are you even going to go?" I did not bother to turn around to face him. I simply opened the heavy oak front door, stepped out into the crisp autumn air of suburban Austin, and pulled the door firmly shut behind me. The heavy metallic click of the latch engaging was the single most satisfying sound I had heard in over 3 years. I walked down the long cobblestone driveway toward my old reliable Ford truck. I paused for a brief moment, resting my hand on the cold metal of the truck door, and looked back at the sprawling estate. I designed and built this house 40 years ago with my late wife, Catherine. I drew every blueprint, calculated, every load-bearing pillar designed, every archway, and positioned every expansive window to look perfectly out over our 2 acres of beautiful Texas hill country. Catherine and I poured our blood, our sweat, and our entire life savings into this soil to create a permanent sanctuary for our family. When she passed away 5 years ago, the house suddenly felt terribly large and suffocatingly quiet. Then exactly 3 years ago, my son Derek came to my door with tears streaming down his face. His highly publicized technology startup had failed spectacularly, leaving him completely bankrupt. He was drowning in massive debt, and his new wife Brittany was absolutely furious with their financial ruin. They begged for a place to stay, to save money and get back on their feet. Because I loved my son, because I clearly remembered the little boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway. I opened my doors and my heart to them. I gave them the entire west guest wing. I paid for all the groceries. I covered the soaring utility bills. I honestly thought I was providing a temporary safety net for my struggling child. I thought I was reinforcing a weakened structure. Instead, I had unknowingly invited highly destructive termites into my foundation. Over the course of 3 years, they aggressively expanded their territory within my home. They moved their belongings from the guest wing into the larger secondary bedrooms. They stopped pretending to browse online for their own houses. They stopped saying thank you for the meals I paid for. I slowly became an unpaid butler, a silent ghost wandering through the halls of my own home, expected to fully fund their lavish new lifestyle while making myself entirely invisible. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the old leather seat creaking familiarly under my weight. I turned the ignition, finding strange comfort in the steady roaring hum of the engine. I pulled out of the driveway, leaving behind the house that held my entire history, feeling a strange sense of liberation washing over my tired bones. I drove exactly 5 miles down the highway to a quiet, unassuming roadside motel I had booked under a false name 3 weeks prior. I carried my small leather overnight bag into the dim room, locked the heavy door, and set my laptop on the cheap laminate desk. I poured myself a glass of tap water, sat down in the stiff chair, and opened my computer screen. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in a highly secure sequence of encrypted passwords. A large grid of video screens instantly popped up on my monitor. They were the feeds from 12 high-definition hidden cameras I had spent the last month meticulously installing behind air conditioning vents, inside hollowed-out bookshelves, and tucked above the thick crown molding of my own house. I adjusted my reading glasses and watched the live feed with intense focus. In the kitchen, Derek was holding his head in his hands, staring blankly at the deactivated credit card resting on the counter. Brittany was pacing back and forth, furiously waving her arms hysterically, pointing aggressively at the massive grocery list and screaming something I could not hear. "The party is just beginning, kids," I whispered to the empty motel room, taking a slow sip of my water. Seeing them panic on the screen brought a deeply bitter sense of validation to my heart. I leaned back in my uncomfortable motel chair and watched Derek finally pick up the credit card. He tried to swipe my card on his mobile banking application, his face contorting in pure, unadulterated frustration when the bright red declined message inevitably popped up on his screen. His total desperation mirrored the exact sinking feeling I had experienced 4 months ago, the exact moment I realized the foundation of my family was completely rotten and beyond any normal repair. It was a blisteringly hot day in mid-July when the first major crack appeared in the facade they had built. I had come home from a long, exhausting afternoon walk to find the main living room completely rearranged. Catherine had spent decades carefully collecting rare antique porcelain vases from our travels around the world. They were beautiful, delicate pieces that she cherished more than anything, representing memories of our youth. They were always displayed proudly on the large stone mantel above the grand fireplace. But that afternoon, the mantel was entirely bare. In their place sat a series of cheap, geometric, ugly modern art sculptures that looked like chunky pieces of painted concrete. I found Brittany in the kitchen, casually sipping a glass of expensive red wine I had specifically bought for a future special occasion. "Where are Catherine vases?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage bubbling in my chest. Brittany barely even glanced at me, completely absorbed in her phone. "Oh, those dusty old things," she said, dismissively waving her hand in the air. "I threw them out in the trash this morning. They completely ruined the modern aesthetic I am trying to create for the living room. Plus, they were just taking up valuable space." Threw them out. I felt a cold, sharp shock hit my chest, stealing the breath directly from my lungs. Those vases were absolutely priceless to me. They were the physical embodiment of anniversary trips, quiet weekends, and deep conversations with my late wife. I stepped forward, demanding she tell me exactly where the trash bags were outside. But Derek walked into the kitchen at that exact moment. He stepped firmly between me and his wife, holding his hands up defensively. "Dad, calm down." Derek had said, his tone thick with heavy condescension and annoyance. "She is just nesting right now. It is totally temporary. You know how stressful things are for us with the current economy. Besides, your old stuff is just gathering dust and taking up room. It is time to update the place and let the past go." I looked at my own son, searching desperately for a single trace of empathy, searching for any trace of respect for his own mother and her memory. I found absolutely nothing. I saw only the annoyance of a selfish man who simply did not want to deal with his elderly father and his emotional attachments. To keep the fragile peace and to avoid a screaming match that would only serve to dangerously raise my blood pressure, I forcefully swallowed my burning anger. I turned around and walked away, retreating silently to the one single place in the massive house that was still truly mine, my home office. It was a spacious room lined with large drafting tables, rolled up architectural blueprints, and tall wooden walls packed with engineering books. It was the one place where I went to think, to breathe, and to remember Catherine in absolute peace. But later that exact same night, I discovered the creeping rot went much deeper than thrown-away porcelain vases. I had gone downstairs to the kitchen to fetch a glass of cold water around midnight. On my slow walk back down the hall, I stopped by my office to grab a heavy textbook I had been reading earlier that day. I reached out and turned the familiar brass knob, but it did not budge an inch. I frowned in the darkness, thinking the old internal lock had somehow jammed. I pushed harder with my shoulder, then leaned in to look closely at the door. The heavy brass knob I had personally installed 40 years ago was completely gone. In its place was a sleek, modern digital keypad deadbolt. A glowing red light blinked at me in the shadows, silently denying me entry to my own private sanctuary. I stood frozen in this dark hallway, my heart pounding, with a slow, incredibly heavy rhythm. My son and his wife had intentionally changed the locks on my private office without telling me, blocking me from my own property. The morning after finding the keypad on my office door, I entered the kitchen with measured steps. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, contrasting the cold reality settling in my chest. Derek and Brittany were seated at the marble island. Derek scrolled through his tablet, dressed in a crisp designer shirt. Brittany spread avocado on toast. I poured a cup of coffee, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy. I walked to the island and stood directly across from my son. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I tried to go into my home office last night to grab a reference book, but I found a digital keypad where my brass lock used to be. Do you know the passcode to my workspace?" Derek flinched, his thumb freezing over the screen. He took a slow sip of coffee, buying time to construct a narrative. When he met my gaze, his eyes were blank. "Oh, right, the lock," he said, forcing a chuckle. "I meant to tell you about that yesterday, Dad. It slipped my mind with my endless work meetings." Brittany set her knife down. She turned to me, her face arranging into a mask of exaggerated concern. "Oh, William," she began, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "We were incredibly worried about you and the security of the house. There have been burglaries in the neighborhood over the past few weeks. People are getting possessions stolen." I stared at her, knowing there had not been a single burglary in our gated community in a decade. Derek chimed in, leaning forward. "Exactly, Dad. Your office has many sensitive financial documents and property deeds. I wanted your sensitive documents locked up safely. You are getting older, and sometimes you forget things and leave the front door unlocked. We have to be careful for your own good. I upgraded the lock to ensure your privacy is protected from outside threats." "My privacy," I repeated softly. "Protected by a lock that I do not possess the combination to open." Brittany reached across the counter, placing her hand over mine. "We also thought about your physical comfort, William. We know how much your knees have been bothering you lately. We moved your reading chair and favorite books down to the basement. We did not want you climbing the stairs so much with your bad knees. The office gets natural sunlight, and Derek needs a professional space for his business ventures. It is a more practical setup for the family. They had exiled me to the windowless basement while taking over my sanctuary, masking their blatant theft as loving care. The structural engineer inside my brain instantly identified the glaring flaws in their architectural lie. You do not protect an elderly man from stairs by moving his reading corner to a basement that requires him to walk down an even steeper flight of wooden steps. The logic was fundamentally broken, designed only to benefit their selfish desires while painting themselves as devoted caretakers. But a good engineer never points out the structural flaw until the demolition charges are set. I nodded slowly, allowing my shoulders to slump, playing the tired, confused old man they desperately wanted me to be. I see, I'm keeping my eyes fixed on the island. Thank you for your concern about my knees. I suppose it does make more sense for Derek to have the sunlight for his work. Derek exhaled a visible breath of relief. Thanks for understanding, Dad. You know we only want what is best for you. I will write down the keypad code for you later. He never wrote down that code, and I never asked for it again. I simply walked away carrying my coffee down the steep stairs into the cold basement, letting them believe they had won the opening skirmish. 2 days later, my silent observation yielded its first piece of devastating evidence. It was Tuesday evening, the day before the neighborhood sanitation trucks made their weekly rounds. My designated chore was to gather the household trash and roll the bins down the cobblestone driveway. I walked into Derek and Brittany's master bathroom to empty their wastebasket. As I lifted the liner, my trained eyes caught something unusual mixed in with discarded cosmetic packaging. It was a massive handful of shredded paper. These were not standard cross-cut shreds. These were long, continuous strips produced by a cheap personal shredder. I paused. Derek and Brittany were lazy. They never shredded standard junk mail. They tossed bills into the recycling bin. For them to take the effort to manually shred a document meant it contained information they actively needed to destroy. Information they needed to keep hidden from me. I did not throw the strips into the main trash bag. Instead, I gathered every ribbon of shredded paper, stuffed them into the pockets of my cardigan, and carried the rest of the garbage out to the street. I retreated to my windowless sanctuary in the basement. I locked the door, cleared space on my folding table, and dumped the crinkled strips under the glare of a desk lamp. I have spent thousands of hours analyzing architectural blueprints and identifying microscopic stress fractures in steel beams. Reassembling a shredded document was child play. I smoothed out each twisted strip, sorting them by subtle variations in font size, ink density, and jagged, torn edges. Anger is a remarkable fuel for intense concentration. After 45 minutes of meticulous alignment, the disjointed strips finally formed a coherent page. I grabbed clear adhesive tape and secured the pieces together, effectively resurrecting the secret they had tried so desperately to kill. I leaned in close, adjusting my reading glasses. It was an official, heavily detailed correspondence from a predatory, high-interest real estate mortgage firm based out of Chicago. The letter was explicitly addressed to my son, Derek Harrison. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, locking onto the bolded financial figures and legal terminology. The firm was formally declining an application for a secondary mortgage loan against the total equity of my estate. The rejection reasoning was stated with brutal clarity. We regret to inform you that we cannot process the requested equity extraction loan at this current time. Public property records clearly indicate that you, Derek Harrison, are not the legal owner of the primary residence listed on the application. To proceed with any borrowing against the estate, the primary title holder must legally co-sign the application, or you must provide binding legal documentation proving full financial conservatorship over the primary property owner. I sat back in my chair, the basement air feeling heavy in my lungs. The sheer audacity of the betrayal washed over me in freezing waves. My own son, the boy I had sheltered, funded, and protected, was attempting to secretly mortgage the house I had built with his mother. He was trying to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash equity from my property to fund his failing lifestyle, risking the roof over my head. The terrifying part of the letter was the final sentence. They needed binding legal documentation proving full financial conservatorship. I stared at that single menacing word until the ink seemed to burn into my retinas. Conservatorship. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were researching the legal mechanisms required to strip away my human rights, to declare me mentally incompetent, and to seize control over my entire existence. The changed locks on my office were not about neighborhood burglaries. They were about isolating my resources, controlling my environment, and laying the groundwork to prove I was losing my mind. The structural integrity of my family was not just compromised, it was rigged to explode. Once you realize a demolition is being planned right under your nose, you begin to view every minor inconvenience as a calculated tactical maneuver. The shredded mortgage letter was the definitive smoking gun, but the warning signs had actually started accumulating a full month prior to that shocking discovery. It was exactly 3 months ago when the weekend invasions officially began. Brittany parents Richard and Patricia lived in a cramped condominium in Ohio. Suddenly, they developed a profound, unexplainable love for the warm Texas climate. They started flying down every single Friday evening and staying until late Sunday night, effectively taking over my home. I had always tolerated them for the sake of family harmony. But their behavior during these new visits shifted dramatically. They no longer acted like polite guests visiting their daughter father-in-law. They strutted through my hallways with the arrogant entitlement of property inspectors evaluating a newly acquired real estate asset. Patricia would casually rearrange the heavy kitchen cabinets, complaining loudly that my organization system was entirely inefficient for a growing family. Richard, a loud man who had spent his entire career selling used farm equipment, would walk around aggressively tapping on my load-bearing walls, making unsolicited comments about knocking them down to create an open-concept floor plan. I would sit in my leather armchair, silently sipping my black coffee, watching them mentally remodel my entire home. Derek never once corrected their rude behavior. He simply hovered in the background, nervously agreeing with every absurd design suggestion they made. The sheer disrespect was absolutely infuriating, but I kept my mouth tightly shut. I desperately needed to observe their hidden structural dynamics before I made my next major move. The absolute breaking point arrived on a particularly bright Saturday morning. I had woken up early, long before the rest of the sleeping house, to enjoy the crisp morning air on the sprawling back patio. The expansive backyard was my ultimate pride and joy. 40 years ago, Catherine and I had planted a small sapling right in the center of the massive lawn. Over the decades, it had miraculously grown into a magnificent towering oak tree with thick, heavy branches that provided a vast canopy of cool shade during the blistering summer months. It was a living, breathing monument to our beautiful marriage. After finishing my morning coffee, I walked back inside the kitchen to grab a local newspaper, leaving the heavy sliding glass door wide open. When I returned exactly 10 minutes later, my quiet peace was entirely shattered. Richard was standing directly in the middle of my perfectly manicured green lawn. I was holding a bright yellow commercial laser tape measure, aiming the glowing red beam precisely at the thick wooden trunk of the old oak tree. I stopped dead in the doorway, narrowing my tired eyes. He clicked the electronic device, muttered a specific measurement number to himself, and scribbled it down frantically on a small pocket notepad. He then walked backward, aiming the laser directly at the outer edge of my concrete patio, repeating the exact same measuring process. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. As a veteran structural engineer, I recognized that specific sequence of physical movements instantly. He was not just casually admiring the beautiful landscaping. He was actively calculating the total square footage of the available open space. He was meticulously plotting a foundational footprint for a new structure. I stepped out onto the patio, intentionally letting the heavy screen door slide shut with a loud, sharp thud that echoed violently across the quiet yard. Richard jumped in shock, nearly dropping his expensive laser measure into the damp morning grass. He spun around rapidly, his face flushing a deep, guilty shade of crimson when he finally realized I was watching his every single move. "What exactly are you doing out here in my yard, Richard?" I asked, my voice carrying across the lawn with the firm, unyielding tone of a seasoned site manager catching a bold trespasser. Before he could formulate a cohesive response, the back door slid open again. Derek rushed out in a frantic panic, his hair disheveled, still wearing his wrinkled pajamas. He must have seen me aggressively confronting his father-in-law from the kitchen window. Derek hurried down the concrete patio steps, his breathing shallow and rapid, a thick layer of nervous sweat already forming prominently on his forehead, despite the remarkably cool morning breeze. Richard quickly recovered his lost composure, aggressively shoving the small notepad deep into his back denim pocket. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded entirely hollow-forced and completely rehearsed. "Just seeing if a nice large guest house would comfortably fit back here, Bill," he said, flashing a wide, utterly dishonest grin. "You know, just hypothetically speaking, of course. Just running some basic preliminary numbers for future resale value. It never ever hurts to know the true financial potential of a residential property, right?" He slapped his large hands together desperately, trying to project a casual, friendly, and innocent demeanor. Derek immediately stepped directly between us, physically blocking my clear line of sight, to Richard's guilty face. "Yes, absolutely," Derek stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the empty yard. "It is just a fun little hypothetical construction project, Dad." Richard absolutely loves watching those home improvement television shows all day long. "We were just talking about it over breakfast this morning. Do not worry about it at all. Let us all go back inside right now. Brittany is making delicious blueberry pancakes for everyone." Derek forcefully herded his father-in-law toward the house, his hand gripping the older man's shoulder with desperate, terrifying urgency. I remained standing perfectly still on the patio, watching them retreat into the kitchen, like two thieves caught fleeing a crime scene. The bright morning sun suddenly felt cold against my aged skin. My gut screamed at me with absolute terrifying certainty. You do not measure a yard unless you are actively planning to dig up the dirt and build something permanent. And you definitely do not plan to build a guest house unless you truly believe you legally own the land beneath it. They were not casually talking about future resale value. They were actively planning their own living arrangements. Richard and Patricia were fully intending to move onto my property permanently. Derek, intense sweating his frantic deflection and his desperate need to instantly change the subject, confirmed my absolute worst fears. They were measuring the exact dimensions of their future home, eagerly waiting for the precise moment I was removed from the picture. The structural integrity of their massive lie was buckling severely under its own immense weight. I did not follow them inside for their fake pancakes. I stayed completely alone in the quiet yard, looking up at the strong branches of Catherine oak tree, silently promising her that I would ruthlessly burn this entire foundation to the ground before I ever let them take it from us. The jagged pieces of their sinister puzzle were finally locking into place, revealing a clear blueprint of pure betrayal. I needed to prepare myself for absolute total war. The realization that my son and his wife were actively plotting to build a new residential structure on my property changed the entire dynamic of my household. I no longer viewed them as merely ungrateful guests taking advantage of my kindness. I viewed them as hostile invaders actively preparing for a ruthless, calculated takeover. However, to legally seize my valuable land and extract the massive cash equity they so desperately needed to fund their lifestyle, they had to somehow bypass one massive, unavoidable obstacle. They had to somehow bypass me. I was the sole legal owner of the sprawling estate, and despite my age, I was in perfectly good physical and mental health. If they could not manipulate or persuade me to sign over the property deed willingly, They had to find a dark legal loophole to forcefully remove my autonomy. That was the exact moment their strategy shifted from quiet, everyday disrespect to aggressive psychological manipulation. It started exactly 2 months ago, wrapping around me so slowly and subtly that a much less observant man would have easily fallen blindly into the trap. The psychological gaslighting began with small, seemingly insignificant household items. I have always been a creature of remarkably strict habit. Every single evening for over 40 years, I placed my heavy set of brass keys in the small hand-painted ceramic bowl near the front wooden door. One Tuesday morning, I reached for my keys, and the ceramic bowl was completely empty. I spent 20 frustrating minutes thoroughly searching the house, only to finally find them tucked deliberately beneath a heavy stack of glossy fashion magazines on the kitchen island. Brittany was casually sipping her morning tea, watching my confusion with a deeply unsettling look of exaggerated pity. "Oh, William," she sighed softly, shaking her head. "You left them on the counter last night when you came in from your evening walk. You really need to be more careful with your failing memory." I knew, for an absolute, undeniable fact, that I had not left my keys on that island. But the strange disappearances stubbornly continued throughout the following weeks. My reading glasses would vanish from my bedside nightstand and miraculously reappear hours later inside the downstairs bathroom cabinet. The daily morning newspaper I always left neatly folded on my desk would suddenly turn up buried in the recycling bin before I even had the chance to read the front page headlines. Then came the carefully orchestrated, highly patronizing conversations. Derek began to speak to me in a slow, painfully gentle tone, the exact kind of voice one might use when addressing a highly confused or frightened toddler. He would constantly ask me if I remembered eating my breakfast, or if I recalled what day of the week it currently was. He would intentionally interrupt me mid-sentence, gently placing his hand on my shoulder, suggesting that I sounded exhausted and needed to go lie down and rest my fragile mind. They were actively manufacturing a totally false reality, laying the crucial psychological groundwork for their ultimate devastating strike. That final strike arrived on an unusually cold, rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, reading a historical biography when the heavy front doorbell rang out loudly. Derek rushed eagerly to open it, ushering a man dressed in a sharp, expensive, tailored suit right into my home. The stranger carried a sleek black leather medical bag in his left hand. He had perfectly slicked back hair, an expensive silver luxury watch on his wrist, and a practiced smile that seemed entirely devoid of any genuine warmth or professional compassion. "Dad," Derek said gently, guiding the stranger into the center of the living room. "This is Dr. Mitchell Harris. He is a highly respected private concierge physician. Brittany and I have just been so incredibly worried about your frequent memory lapses and strange behaviors lately. We wanted to bring a trusted specialist right to the house for a simple routine checkup, just to make sure your cognitive functions are still in good working shape. It is completely normal for someone your advanced age to need a little extra medical evaluation and support." I looked silently at Dr. Harris. A legitimate ethical medical professional does not conduct surprise neurological evaluations in an elderly patient living room without any prior consent, medical history, or warning. I immediately recognized the grim, terrifying reality of the situation unfolding before my eyes. This man was not here to heal me, support me, or evaluate my health objectively. He was a hired corporate mercenary brought in specifically to legally certify a predetermined, highly fraudulent medical diagnosis. He was the corrupt architect they desperately needed to condemn my mental foundation. Dr. Harris sat down comfortably on the leather sofa opposite me, pulling a shiny silver pen and a thick white notepad from his leather bag. "Hello, William," he said smoothly, deliberately using my first name with highly inappropriate familiarity. "Derek tells me you have been struggling significantly with some deep confusion and constantly misplacing your personal belongings. I am just going to ask you a few very simple questions today. There is absolutely no need to feel anxious or embarrassed by this process. I stared at him, my engineering mind operating at maximum processing speed. If I aggressively threw them out of my house right then and there, they would simply record the incident and claim I was being erratic, paranoid, and violently hostile. That reaction would only serve to further fuel their fabricated, twisted narrative of advancing dementia. I desperately needed to see exactly how far down the rabbit hole they were truly willing to take this elaborate charade. I needed to let them confidently document their own massive criminal conspiracy. So I took a deep, slow, steadying breath and made the conscious decision to deliver the exact tragic performance they were paying for. "Okay," I murmured quietly, deliberately, letting my vocal cords waver slightly to project a false sense of vulnerability. "I suppose I have been feeling a little bit forgetful and confused lately." The doctor smiled broadly, a predatory, victorious gleam flashing brightly in his dark eyes. He immediately began his highly patronizing and insulting medical interrogation. He asked me to slowly state my full legal name, my exact date of birth, and the current calendar year. He asked me to count backward from the number 100 by intervals of 7. He handed me a completely blank piece of paper and asked me to draw the round face of an analog clock, showing the precise time as 10 minutes past 11. I answered the basic biographical questions correctly, but I intentionally hesitated and stumbled slightly on the required mental math. I purposefully drew the requested clock with slightly shaky, uneven hands, making the numbers just a little disorganized and poorly spaced on the paper. I acted exactly like a fiercely proud older man trying desperately to hide his rapidly failing mind, offering them just enough perceived weakness to keep their horrific plan in motion. Throughout the entire humiliating process, I kept my eyes locked firmly on the doctor, silently memorizing every single detail about him. His full name, the specific corporate logo engraved on his expensive pen, the specific formatting of his medical notepad, and the emblem on his leather bag. I mentally cataloged absolutely everything for my future counterattack. After 20 agonizing minutes, Dr. Harris finally packed up his medical bag and stood up from the sofa. "Thank you for your cooperation, William," he said smoothly. "You did your absolute best. You just stay right here in your comfortable chair and rest your tired mind." He walked out into the main hallway, with Derek trailing closely behind him. I remained seated in my armchair, perfectly still, straining my ears to listen to their hushed, secretive conversation taking place near the heavy front door. "It is exactly as we suspected," Derek the doctor whispered, his tone incredibly serious and professionally grave. "He is showing classic, undeniable, and severe signs of rapid cognitive decline. I will personally draft the official medical affidavit tonight and have it legally notarized by tomorrow morning at my clinic. With my certified clinical evaluation in hand, your lawyer will have absolutely no problem pushing the conservatorship application right through the local family court system. You are doing the absolute right thing for him, Derek. He simply cannot manage his own personal affairs or his massive estate any longer." Derek thanked him profusely, his voice thick with a deeply sickening layer of fake relief and false gratitude. The heavy front door clicked shut. I sat completely alone in the quiet living room, my aged hands gripping the leather armrests of my chair so incredibly tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The shredded mortgage rejection letter, the precise laser measurements in the backyard, the deliberately hidden keys, and now a fully corrupted medical professional willing to commit blatant fraud. The grand, horrifying design of their ultimate betrayal was finally completely and undeniably exposed. They were not patiently waiting for me to pass away naturally in my sleep. They were legally and systematically burying me while my lungs were still drawing breath. They were building an airtight, fraudulent medical case to ruthlessly strip me of my basic human rights, declare me entirely mentally incompetent, and seize total undisputed financial control over my home, my savings, and my assets. Once Derek finally obtained the court-ordered conservatorship, he could legally mortgage the entire house, build whatever massive guest structure he wanted in the backyard for his in-laws, or infinitely worse, permanently lock me away in a dismal, depressing care facility, completely against my will. They truly believed they had successfully outsmarted a frail, helpless, and senile old man. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared total, unforgiving war on a master structural engineer who knew exactly how to trigger a catastrophic collapse. The transition from the basement realization required a shift from passive observation to active testing. I knew they were building a fraudulent medical case against me, but I needed to know their exact timeline. I needed to know the specific deadline they were working toward so I could properly calibrate my counteroffensive. That crucial piece of intelligence arrived exactly 1 month ago, delivered under the cover of darkness. Following the disastrous visit from their hired concierge doctor, Brittany became highly invested in my daily medication routine. She started bringing me a small cup of chamomile tea every single evening, claiming the warm herbal drink would help soothe my nerves and improve my deteriorating sleep quality. Along with the tea, she would place a heavy prescription-strength sleeping pill on a small ceramic saucer. Derek told me the doctor had strongly recommended the powerful sedative to prevent me from wandering around the large house at night and potentially injuring myself. I accepted the tea and the pill with a trembling hand, thanking her profusely for her deep, loving care. I would take a slow sip of the hot tea while she watched me with hawk-like intensity. Then I would place the pill on my tongue, take a large gulp of liquid, and swallow hard. Satisfied that her elderly father-in-law was properly sedated, she would smile brightly, wish me a good night, and firmly close my bedroom door. What Brittany did not know was that I had spent 40 years working on loud, chaotic construction sites, dealing with all kinds of shady contractors. I knew exactly how to palm a small object with the swift, unnoticeable sleight of hand of a street magician. The exact moment her footsteps faded down the long hallway, I would spit the heavy sedative into a tissue and flush it quietly down the adjoining bathroom toilet. I poured the remainder of the tea directly into the bathroom sink. I would then lie perfectly still in the dark, my eyes wide open, listening to the subtle, shifting sounds of my own house. A well-built house breathes at night. The wooden framing contracts as the temperature drops. The copper pipes hum gently when the water pressure equalizes. As a veteran structural engineer, I knew the unique acoustic signature of every single hallway, every staircase, and every floorboard in that sprawling estate. I knew exactly where to step to avoid the telltale squeak of settling wood. It was a remarkably cold Tuesday night when my nightly vigilance finally paid off. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed with a faint green light, reading exactly 2:00 in the morning. The entire house was completely silent, wrapped in a thick, heavy blanket of darkness. I heard the faint, muffled sound of a voice echoing up from the massive kitchen directly below my master bedroom suite. I threw back my heavy blankets and slid out of bed, intentionally leaving my comfortable slippers on the floor. I walked barefoot across the thick carpet, moving with the slow, deliberate precision of a predator stalking its prey. I opened my bedroom door, mere inches slipping smoothly through the narrow gap. I navigated the long, dark hallway by stepping only on the outer edges of the floorboards, directly over the solid supporting joists, completely eliminating any sound of my movement. I reached the top of the grand wooden staircase that overlooked the main living area. I crouched down low behind the thick oak banister, perfectly concealed in the deep shadows. Through the intricate wooden spindles, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the kitchen below. Brittany was standing completely alone by the large marble island. Only the small, dim light above the stove was illuminated, casting a pale, yellowish glow across her sharp facial features. She was holding her mobile phone tightly to her ear, a half-empty glass of white wine resting on the counter directly in front of her. She was speaking in a hushed, excited whisper. But the superior acoustics of the high-vaulted ceiling carried her voice directly up the grand staircase to my waiting ears. "It is completely done, Mom," Brittany whispered, her tone vibrating with a sickening mixture of malicious triumph and sheer relief. "The doctor signed the official evaluation papers this afternoon. He formally certified that William has severe, irreversible cognitive decline. Derek is taking the medical documents directly to the family court lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. I held my breath in the total darkness, my heart turning into a solid block of freezing ice in my chest. I know it took much longer than we originally planned. Brittany continued taking a quick sip of her wine. But you have to understand how incredibly careful we had to be. We could not just rush the medical process. The local judge has to fully believe Derek is a devoted, loving son making a heartbreaking medical decision for his deeply confused father. But the legal groundwork is finally totally secure. She paused for a moment, closely listening to whatever her mother Patricia was saying on the other end of the line. A wide, greedy smile stretched across Brittany's face, revealing her teeth in the dim stove light. Yes, everything is perfectly on schedule, she answered, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated arrogance. By the second week of November, the local judge will grant Derek full financial and medical conservatorship. The very next day, the old man will be permanently locked away in the Sunset Meadows Care Facility. We already paid the initial admission deposit using the cash advance from Derek's new business loan. Sunset Meadows. It was a notoriously bleak, depressing, and highly restrictive private nursing facility located 3 towns over. It was the exact kind of grim, isolated place where terrible families sent their inconvenient elderly relatives to be quietly forgotten and heavily medicated into absolute submission. They were not just trying to casually steal my comfortable home. They were actively paying money to have me medically imprisoned in a chemical straitjacket for the rest of my natural life. Brittany laughed softly, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed violently in the quiet kitchen. You can go ahead and tell all 50 relatives back in Ohio to start packing their bags. Right now, Mom. We are going to have the biggest, most luxurious Thanksgiving celebration this family has ever seen. The master bedroom suite will be completely cleared out and ready for you and Dad by the time you drive down here. The entire house is finally ours. She finished her glass of wine in one large gulp. She ended the phone call, turned off the stove light, and walked away. I remained crouching behind the oak banister. The deep emotional pain of my son's horrific betrayal had already burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, calculating logic of a master engineer analyzing a critically compromised structure. My own flesh and blood had become a highly destructive parasite, attempting to hijack the host structure. If the parasites wanted to forcefully hijack the host, the only logical structural solution was to completely detonate the host while the parasites were still securely trapped inside. The morning sun broke through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the marble island. I walked in, slowly dragging my feet more than usual, ensuring my slippers scuffed loudly against the hardwood floor. Derek was typing on his laptop, while Brittany hummed a cheerful tune arranging berries on a ceramic platter. I approached the coffee maker, letting my hands tremble violently as I reached for my favorite mug. Derek looked up, his jaw tightening with annoyance. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice loud and slow. I blinked, looking around vacantly before focusing on him. "Pour my coffee, son," I asked, pitching my voice to sound thin and reedy. "My hands are not working right today." Derek exchanged a quick glance with Brittany. It was a look of pure, malicious validation. "Of course, Dad," he said, stepping over to pour the dark liquid. "Just sit down before you drop something else." I sat at the island, wrapping my trembling hands around the warm mug. They thought my sudden decline was a convenient stroke of luck, unaware that they were watching a carefully calculated performance. I finished my drink, stood up with a heavy sigh, and announced I was going to the pharmacy. Derek waved me off. "Take your time, do not get lost." I walked out to my old Ford truck, leaving my acting performance at the front door. My posture straightened. My hands stopped shaking, and my mind locked into absolute focus. I drove directly into downtown Austin, bypassing the pharmacy entirely. I pulled into the private parking garage of the regional banking branch, where I had maintained my accounts for 40 years. I walked through the heavy glass doors and headed straight for the branch manager office. Her name was Linda, a sharp professional who had helped me set up my initial construction loans decades ago. She welcomed me and pleased to see me. I sat down opposite her desk. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "I need you to pull up every single inquiry application or alert attached to my residential property address within the last 60 days. Linda frowned, sensing the severe gravity in my tone. She typed rapidly on her keyboard. After a few moments, her professional demeanor shifted into genuine concern. "William," she began carefully, "someone attempted to initiate a massive secondary equity extraction loan against your estate exactly 2 weeks ago. The application requested a cash withdrawal of $400,000. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "Who filed the application?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She turned her monitor slightly toward me. "It was submitted by your son, Derek. However, the application was flagged and rejected by our underwriting department. His name is not on the property deed, and he holds no legal financial power of attorney over your estate. He tried to bypass the system by claiming he was a co-signer, but the automated checks shut it down instantly." I stared at the screen, looking at the digital footprint of my son's unforgivable greed. He was actively trying to drain the massive equity Catherine and I had spent our entire lives building. Linda looked at me with deep sympathy. "William, this constitutes attempted financial fraud. Do you want me to alert the fraud department?" I shook my head slowly. "Not yet, Linda. I need to handle this internal structural failure myself." I thanked her for her help and walked back out into the bright Texas sunlight. I sat in the cab of my truck, the engine turned off, staring blankly at the concrete wall of the parking garage. The isolated puzzle pieces I had been collecting over the past month suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. The shredded mortgage rejection letter in the bathroom trash, the late-night phone call discussing the private care facility, the corrupt concierge doctor asking me to draw a clock in my own living room. It all formed a singular, devastating blueprint. Derek needed $400,000, but the bank had firmly locked him out because he lacked the legal authority to leverage my property. He needed a legal mechanism to bypass my ownership. The answer was a conservatorship. In the state of Texas, if an elderly property owner is declared medically incompetent and incapable of managing their own financial affairs, a family member can petition the family court to be appointed as their legal guardian. The conservator gains total, unchecked control over the individual bank accounts, properties, and medical decisions. To convince a judge to strip away a man's fundamental human rights, you need undeniable medical proof of severe cognitive decline. That was the exact purpose of the slick doctor with the expensive silver watch. The fraudulent medical evaluation was not just a piece of paper. It was the golden ticket required to open the doors of the courthouse. The doctor was going to swear under oath that I suffered from rapid, irreversible dementia. Derek would stand before a judge playing the role of the heartbroken, devoted son, waving that signed medical affidavit. The judge, seeing the falsified professional medical opinion, would grant Derek emergency financial and medical control over my life to protect me from myself. Once the judge banged the gavel, Derek would be handed the master keys to my entire existence. He would take that court order directly back to Linda at the bank, instantly overriding the previous rejection. He would sign the secondary mortgage application as my legal conservator, extracting the $400,000 to pay off his massive debts. But the ultimate horror of their plan went far beyond financial theft. To ensure I never discovered the missing money, they had to physically remove me from the board. That was where Sunset Meadows came in. Armed with full medical power of attorney, Derek and Brittany could legally force me into a locked, restrictive memory care facility against my will. They would hand the staff the fraudulent diagnosis, ensuring I was heavily sedated and kept away from legal counsel. They would lock me in a chemical prison for the remainder of my natural life, leaving my massive custom-built estate completely empty and ready for Brittany, 50 incoming relatives, to occupy permanently. It was a structural demolition, perfectly designed from the inside out, utilizing the local legal system and the medical field as their heavy machinery. They had identified my ownership as the primary load-bearing wall standing in their way, and they had methodically rigged it with legal explosives. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck until my knuckles turned white. They thought they had designed a flawless, inescapable trap for a weak, vulnerable old man. But they had fundamentally miscalculated the core strength of the materials they were dealing with. They forgot that I spent 40 years identifying microscopic weaknesses in concrete and steel. Sitting in the dark parking garage, the deep, agonizing pain of a father-broken heart completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by the cold, calculating and ruthless precision of an engineer preparing for war. I started the engine of my truck, my mind drafting the blueprints for their absolute destruction. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto the highway, leaving my son, desperate financial trail behind me. When you discover a critical failure in a building, you do not hire a decorator to cover the cracks. You bring in a demolition expert who understands the mechanics of a controlled implosion. For my legal needs, that expert was Martin Bradley. I drove 20 miles to the rural outskirts of the city, pulling my old truck into the gravel lot of a roadside diner. It was the kind of isolated establishment where truckers stopped for burnt coffee and nobody paid attention to conversations in the corner booths. It was the perfect location for a discreet tactical meeting. I walked through the smudged glass doors. Sitting in the furthest booth, looking entirely out of place in his tailored charcoal suit and silk tie, was Martin. He was a ruthless shark like estate lawyer who handled my complex corporate construction contracts for 2 decades. He possessed a razor-sharp legal mind and a cold disposition that terrified opposing counsel. Martin did not care about family sentiment. He cared strictly about absolute legal victories. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him, placing my manila folder directly onto the sticky table. "You look terrible," William Martin said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his black coffee without breaking eye contact. I assume this secretive meeting is not simply to catch up on old times. I did not waste a second on pleasantries. I slid the meticulously taped strips of the shredded mortgage rejection letter across the table. I followed it with a transcript I had handwritten from the late-night phone call I intercepted between Brittany and her mother. Finally, I provided the clinical details of the corrupt concierge doctor they brought into my living room. I sat back and watched as Martin read through the assembled evidence, his eyes scanning the documents with the calculated speed of a predatory animal. A genuinely amused smile spread across Martin's face. He let out a dark chuckle that vibrated with disbelief. "Your son is a remarkably stupid individual, William," he said, tapping his finger against the taped letter. "Attempting a covered equity extraction loan on an estate without holding the proper legal title is amateur hour. But hiring a black market physician to fabricate a severe dementia diagnosis so he can fraudulently secure a judicial conservatorship crosses into serious criminal conspiracy." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "They plan to legally declare you mentally incompetent, lock you in a memory care facility, and use the court order to seize total control of your real estate equity." I nodded slowly, pushing the betrayal aside for pure logic. "I know exactly what their architectural blueprint is, Martin. What I need from you is the heavy machinery required to crush their foundation. How do we block the conservatorship hearing?" Martin adjusted his silk tie, his eyes gleaming. "We can easily block the medical order. I will file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. We will demand an independent neurological evaluation from an unbiased state physician. That will instantly destroy their fake diagnosis and derail Derek application. We can protect your assets and keep you safely in your home." I stared at Martin across the table, my expression remaining completely flat. I took a slow sip of the terrible diner coffee before I spoke. "You are completely missing the structural point, Martin. I do not want to simply block their legals application. I want to let them believe they have completely won. I want them to move all 50 of those leeches from Ohio down here, expecting a luxurious Thanksgiving celebration. I want them to stand inside my house, thinking they finally own the ground beneath their feet. And then I want to completely detonate the structure right on top of their heads. Martin raised a single eyebrow, confused by my strategy. William, if you let Derek get the conservatorship order signed by the judge, he will immediately march to the bank and seize your house. You are playing a very dangerous game of chicken with your own property deed. I leaned forward, a cold, triumphant smile breaking through my stoic facade. That is the ultimate beauty of this entire structural design, Martin. Derek cannot legally seize my house because I do not legally own that house. Martin froze his coffee cup, hovering inches from his mouth. What exactly are you talking about, William? I bought that land and built that house 40 years ago, I explained quietly. But exactly 15 years ago, shortly after Derek finished college and started showing signs of extreme financial irresponsibility, Catherine and I made a highly strategic legal decision. We did not want our hard-earned legacy squandered by a reckless child. Do you remember the corporate restructuring we did for my engineering firm back then? Martin's eyes widened in sudden profound realization. The holding company, he whispered in sheer disbelief. Exactly, I confirmed. 15 years ago, I transferred the full deed of the residential estate along with my liquid retirement assets directly into an irrevocable blind trust. That trust is technically owned and managed by the corporate holding company we established in Delaware. On paper, William Harrison does not own a multi-million-dollar estate in Texas. On paper, I am just a simple tenant living in a property owned by a faceless corporate entity. Even if Derek successfully bribes a judge, obtains the fraudulent medical conservatorship, and strips away my personal rights, he will inherit nothing but an empty bank account. The house is completely untouchable. He will hit an absolute impenetrable brick wall. Martin leaned back in the vinyl booth, letting out a loud laugh that caused a nearby trucker to turn and look at us. That is an absolute masterpiece of defensive architecture, William. Your son is spending thousands of dollars to steal a treasure chest that does not even belong to you. But if you are entirely protected by the blind trust, what exactly is your plan for the Thanksgiving invasion? Martin asked, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye. Why not just kick them out right now and be done with this miserable situation? Because simply kicking them out does not teach a parasite to stop feeding, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. If I throw them out today, they will spin a tragic narrative painting me as an abusive father. They need to experience the absolute catastrophic failure of their own design. I want you to draft a legally binding notice of eviction on behalf of the corporate holding company. But I do not want you to serve it to them yet. I have a highly coordinated demolition schedule in mind for the Thanksgiving holiday, and I need your best legal precision to execute it flawlessly. We are going to let them set the table, Martin. And then we are going to burn the entire dining room completely down to the ground. Martin leaned across the sticky table of the diner, a slow, predatory smile stretching across his sharp face. He understood exactly what kind of demolition I was commissioning. He pulled a fresh legal pad from his expensive leather briefcase and uncapped his pen. If we are going to execute a flawless tactical strike, we need to strictly follow the letter of Texas property law, he explained, his voice low and meticulous. The corporate holding company that officially owns your estate must formally issue a 30-day notice to quit. This document terminates their status as permitted residents and officially designates them as trespassers if they refuse to vacate the premises. I nodded in agreement, tracking the structural logic of his legal maneuver. But if you mail a formal eviction notice to my address, Derek will undoubtedly find it. He obsessively checks the mailbox every single afternoon, waiting for updates from his corrupt medical lawyer. If he sees a corporate letterhead demanding his immediate departure, he will panic and adjust his strategy. We cannot allow him to see the wrecking ball coming before it physically hits the wall. Martin chuckled softly, writing a swift note on his pad. That is precisely why the notice will be sent via certified mail with a highly specific delivery tracking mandate, he replied. As the designated primary tenant of the holding company, you have the legal right to sign for any certified corporate correspondence delivered to that address. You simply need to intercept the postal carrier before Derek wakes up. Once you sign for the envelope, the legal clock officially begins ticking. From a purely judicial standpoint, they will be properly served and legally warned. Hiding the document from their greedy eyes is merely a domestic communication issue, irrelevant to the holding company right to reclaim its property. The plan was structurally perfect. Over the next 30 days, I transformed myself into the ultimate gatekeeper of my own front porch. Every single morning, long before the Texas sun crept above the horizon, I would wake up and sit quietly by the large bay window in the living room. I monitored the street with the intense, unwavering focus of a night watchman. Derek and Brittany enjoyed sleeping in late, exhausted from their late-night scheming and online shopping sprees. The moment the white postal truck turned onto our quiet suburban street, I would slip out the front door, walk down the cobblestone driveway, and personally greet the mail carrier. When the thick, ominous certified envelope from Martin Law Firm finally arrived, I calmly signed my name on the digital scanner. I walked back inside, slid the heavy envelope under my mattress, and went to the kitchen to brew my morning coffee. Derek stumbled downstairs an hour later, completely oblivious to the fact that his legal eviction had just been officially codified. With the legal countdown officially running, I needed to secure the physical mechanism of their removal. A standard eviction required a sheriff deputy to knock on the door and ask them to leave. That was far too gentle. I did not want them politely escorted out. I wanted them desperately fleeing from a massive, undeniable catastrophe. I spent 3 days rigorously researching industrial maintenance services, specifically looking for heavy-duty pest control contractors who specialized in treating massive agricultural facilities and large commercial warehouses. I did not want a man with a tiny spray can. I needed a full-scale military-grade fumigation operation. I eventually found exactly what I was looking for in a highly rated, heavily insured industrial extermination company based out of Dallas. They utilized a highly toxic, incredibly potent sulfuryl fluoride gas designed to penetrate thick concrete and eradicate deep-rooted termite infestations. The chemical treatment was so severe that local municipal law strictly mandated a complete total evacuation of the entire premises, strictly enforced by a mandatory police presence during the initial deployment phase. I drove to their regional office and sat down with their senior operations manager. I presented myself as the authorized representative of the corporate holding company that owned the massive estate. I explained that we had discovered a severe, rapidly spreading structural termite infestation in the foundation, and we required an immediate comprehensive tenting and fumigation of the entire property. The manager pulled up the satellite imagery of my sprawling house on his computer monitor. "This is a massive residential structure, sir," he noted, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Tenting a building this large will require a specialized crew, heavy industrial equipment, and at least 48 hours of absolute vacancy. It will be an incredibly expensive operation." I pulled out my checkbook, backed by the impenetrable wealth of my blind trust, and looked him dead in the eye. "Money is absolutely no object when it comes to protecting the structural integrity of this estate," I told him firmly. "I will pay double your standard commercial rate, plus a generous premium for holiday scheduling. I need your largest crew, your thickest yellow hazard tents, and a mandatory police escort to secure the perimeter. And I need the operation to commence exactly at noon on the 4th Thursday of November." The manager paused, his eyebrows shooting up in genuine surprise. "The 4th Thursday of November," he repeated slowly. "Sir, that is Thanksgiving Day. Are you entirely sure you want to gas a massive residential property right in the middle of a major family holiday?" I certainly did not blink. I did not hesitate. "I am absolutely certain," I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, unyielding register. "The parasitic infestation in this specific house is severe, deeply entrenched, and multiplying rapidly. If we do not completely gas the property on that exact day, the parasites will permanently destroy the entire foundation." The manager stared at me for a long moment, sensing the absolute unshakable resolve in my voice. He printed out the massive contract, and I signed my name with bold, heavy strokes. The trap was now fully funded, fully legal, and firmly locked into the calendar. The final weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were a fascinating study in psychological endurance. I continued to play my assigned role as the frail, declining, and increasingly confused elderly father. I allowed Derek to guide me by the elbow. I allowed Brittany to serve me my morning toast with her fake syrupy smile. I watched them eagerly prepare for the arrival of her 50 relatives from Ohio. They ordered expensive floral centerpieces, bought cases of premium imported wine, and excitedly discussed which of my personal belongings they would throw in the dumpster to make room for her parents' permanent luggage. Every time they insulted me, every time they spoke down to me, I simply smiled and nodded. My silence was not submission. My silence was the quiet ticking of a massive, heavily armed bomb. I spent my evenings sitting alone in the cold basement, drawing detailed architectural sketches of my future cabin in the mountains, completely at peace with the impending destruction. They were busy setting the dining room table with my silver cutlery, entirely unaware that the wrecking ball was already swinging through the air, aimed directly at their heads. The digital clock on my motel nightstand flipped to 6 o'clock in the evening. It was Wednesday, the official eve of Thanksgiving, just hours after I had dramatically walked out of my own front door and left my deactivated metal credit card resting on the marble kitchen island. I sat comfortably in my cheap vinyl chair, a small glass of neat bourbon in my hand, staring intently at the glowing grid of security camera feeds on my laptop monitor. The atmosphere inside my house had shifted from smug arrogance to absolute suffocating panic. Brittany was pacing the length of the kitchen, her expensive smartphone pressed tightly against her ear, while Derek stood frozen near the stainless steel refrigerator. He was holding my heavy metal credit card, staring at it, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. I had called my private banking manager, Linda, the moment I checked into the motel room, instructing her to instantly freeze every single account associated with my name. I also completely disabled the authorized user limits I had previously established for my son. When Derek attempted to place a massive expedited online order for premium groceries, vintage wine, and expensive floral arrangements, the digital payment gateway immediately rejected the transaction. Through the hidden microphone, embedded securely in the ceiling molding, I listened to the glorious symphony of their total financial collapse. Derek frantically dialed the customer service number on the back of the card, barking angry, desperate orders at the automated voice assistant. Brittany was practically pulling her hair out, her perfectly manicured nails digging fiercely into her scalp. 50 people are getting in their cars right now, Derek, she screamed, her voice shrill and entirely stripped of its usual sweet veneer. My parents, my aunts, my uncles, they are all expecting a fully catered luxury holiday experience. You told me your father was going to cover absolutely everything. You promised me we had full access to his accounts. Derek slammed his phone down onto the granite countertop, his face flushed with deep, humiliated rage. The automated system says the card has been reported as stolen, and the account is entirely locked, he shouted back, rubbing his temples in utter distress. The old man must have completely lost his fragile mind and called the bank in a paranoid frenzy before he drove off. He has absolutely no idea what he is doing to us. We have absolutely no money to buy food for 50 people, Brittany. Our joint checking account is already severely overdrawn from the admission deposit we sent to the Sunset Meadows Care Facility. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my smooth bourbon. They had gleefully drained their own meager savings to secure my permanent chemical imprisonment, leaving themselves entirely destitute, just hours before their massive family invasion. Brittany sank onto one of the expensive leather bar stools, burying her face in her trembling hands. She began to sob, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated selfishness. "We cannot cancel Thanksgiving," she whined. dark mascara tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup. My entire family will think we are complete failures. They genuinely think we own this massive estate. They think we are incredibly wealthy. You have to fix this nightmare right now, Derek. Do whatever it takes to get the money. Derek groaned loudly, a sound of profound defeat echoing through the spacious kitchen. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his personal brown leather wallet. He slowly extracted a worn, bright red credit card. It was a high-interest emergency credit card he had hidden away, one that I knew, for a documented fact, was already dangerously close to its maximum borrowing limit. He stared at the small plastic rectangle with intense, overwhelming dread. "We are going to have to drive to the discount supermarket on the dusty edge of town," he muttered miserably. "We have to buy everything generic and cheap. No premium organic turkey, no imported wine, no expensive catered side dishes. We have to do this entirely on a strict budget, and we have to cook every single thing ourselves tonight." I watched the bright screen as they scrambled out the front door. Their previous arrogant composure completely shattered by the brutal reality of their empty pockets. They returned 2 grueling hours later, dragging themselves heavily through the front door, with their weary arms burdened by cheap, thin plastic grocery bags. The stark contrast between their grand, luxurious expectations and their current pathetic reality was incredibly satisfying to witness from my distant screen. Derek hauled 2 massive, rock-hard frozen turkeys onto the kitchen island. They were generic supermarket brands, heavily discounted, and completely solid with dark ice. Brittany angrily dumped bags of instant powdered mashed potatoes, cheap canned cranberry sauce, and cardboard boxes of processed stuffing mix onto the pristine marble counter. She looked at the towering pile of highly processed food with absolute unmasked disgust. "I cannot believe I have to serve my highly respectable parents powdered potatoes out of a cardboard box," she complained bitterly, slamming a heavy bottle of cheap screw-top wine onto the counter. "This pathetic mess is all your father's fault, Derek. The exact moment the judge signs that conservatorship order on Friday morning, I am personally picking out the worst, most restrictive room at that nursing home for him. I am going to make absolutely sure he never sees the light of day ever again." Derek did not bother to argue with her vicious, cruel threats. He simply grabbed a heavy steel chef and began hacking aggressively at the frozen poultry, packaging his face set in a grim, hardened mask of pure physical exhaustion. "You just focus on peeling those cheap potatoes," he snapped back fiercely. "Once Friday comes, we will never have to worry about money or that stubborn old man ever again. The entire house will be legally ours, and we can finally breathe." I sat comfortably in my quiet motel room, watching their grueling, desperate kitchen marathon unfold deep into the silent night. Midnight slowly came and went. At 2 a.m, Derek was covered in a thick layer of grease and white flour, furiously scrubbing burnt metal pots in the sink, while cursing viciously under his breath. Brittany was visibly exhausted, her blonde hair frizzy and entirely unkempt, desperately trying to quickly thaw a solid block of frozen turkey breast under a steady stream of warm tap water. They snapped at each other relentlessly, their fragile marriage severely fracturing under the intense pressure of sudden physical labor and severe financial restriction. They were miserable, profoundly exhausted, and utterly furious. Yet despite their physical exhaustion, their arrogance remained completely intact. As the clock crept toward 4 a.m, they finally collapsed into the chairs, staring blankly at the mediocre food. Derek rubbed his tired, bloodshot eyes and let out a heavy sigh. "Just get through tomorrow, Brittany," he mumbled, squeezing her tired hand. "By Friday morning, the judge will hand me the legal documents. We will forcibly evict the old man, and everything will be perfect." I closed my laptop screen, smiling peacefully in the dark. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. I woke up in my quiet motel room just before dawn, feeling an incredible sense of absolute calm. I took my time. I showered, dressed in a comfortable but sharp button-down shirt, and poured myself a cup of standard drip coffee from the lobby. I walked back to my room, sat at the small laminate desk, and opened my laptop. The digital clock in the bottom corner of my screen clicked precisely to 10 in the morning. Right on schedule. The quiet manicured street in front of my sprawling Texas estate was suddenly shattered by the deafening roar of heavy engines. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, and watched the high-definition security feed. A massive, chaotic convoy of vehicles began to aggressively pull into my long, cobblestone driveway. There were at least 6 large, battered minivans, heavily packed with passengers and luggage strapped haphazardly to their roofs. But what truly solidified the pure, unadulterated reality of their sinister plot were the vehicles trailing right behind the vans. 2 massive, bright orange moving trucks lumbered heavily onto the property, their thick tires crushing the delicate border of Catherine, carefully maintained rose bushes. They parked haphazardly across the manicured front lawn, completely blocking the main exit. This was not a family gathering for a traditional holiday dinner. This was a highly coordinated, full-scale residential invasion. The heavy metal doors of the moving trucks rolled up with a loud, grating screech that I could hear perfectly through the hidden porch microphone. An absolute sea of loud, incredibly obnoxious relatives from Ohio began pouring out of the vehicles. There were easily 50 people swarming my front yard, shouting across the lawn, dragging heavy pieces of worn luggage over the stone steps. My eyes narrowed as I watched them aggressively unload their heavy cargo. They were not carrying simple overnight bags or small holiday gifts for their generous hosts. They were actively hauling thick, queen-sized mattresses, heavy wooden dressers, and massive flat-screen televisions straight up my front steps. Young children were running wildly through the delicate flower beds, while older men carried large cardboard boxes, packed tightly with cheap kitchen appliances and old tools. They were actively moving their entire lives into my beautiful home. Derek stood completely frozen on the front porch, his mouth hanging wide open in sheer disbelief as the relentless tide of humanity pushed forcefully past his shoulders. Brittany parents, Richard and Patricia, confidently led the aggressive charge. They marched through the heavy oak front doors with the supreme, unapologetic arrogance of conquering generals claiming a newly surrendered territory. I immediately switched my camera feed to the second-floor hallway. I watched as Richard and Patricia marched directly past the designated guest wing, turning sharply toward the massive, heavily carved wooden doors of my private master suite. Patricia kicked the door open, dropping her heavy leather purse directly onto my pristine mahogany dressing table without a single second of hesitation. She clapped her hands together loudly, directing a group of sweating young men to drag their stained mattress right into the exact center of my personal room. Richard walked over to my large bay window, looking out over the backyard with a smug, deeply triumphant smile spreading across his face. They were aggressively staking their permanent claim, entirely convinced that I was already halfway to a locked medical ward and completely unable to stop them. I gently clicked my computer mouse, switching the primary video feed down to the massive main kitchen. The scene unfolding there was an absolute masterpiece of pure, unfiltered chaos. The spacious room was completely packed with impatient, incredibly demanding guests. They were aggressively opening my custom cabinetry, violently slamming the stainless steel refrigerator doors, and loudly complaining about the stark lack of premium refreshments. A large, bearded man, who I assumed was Brittany's uncle, was loudly demanding to know exactly where the imported beer and top-shelf liquor were being kept. Several older women were poking critically at the generic store-bought frozen pies resting on the marble island, openly mocking the incredibly cheap presentation. Brittany was standing near the massive double ovens, actively experiencing a complete severe psychological breakdown right in front of her greedy family. Her face was flushed dark red, and her hands shook violently as she desperately tried to manage the 2 rock-hard generic turkeys they had purchased the night before. The massive birds were still partially frozen solid in the center, leaking cold, bloody water all over the pristine marble countertops. She had absolutely no idea how to properly feed 50 hungry, highly critical people without the endless flowing stream of my retirement money to blindly fund a luxury catering service. Derek rushed into the crowded kitchen, his hair wild and his eyes wide with sheer unadulterated panic. He grabbed Brittany forcefully by the arm, dragging her roughly into the dark corner of the walk-in pantry. But the hidden microphone, positioned perfectly above the shelving, picked up every single desperate word of their furious argument. "You clearly told me they were just bringing small overnight bags," Derek hissed fiercely, gesturing wildly toward the noisy chaos unfolding in the front yard. "There is literally a dirty washing machine sitting in my driveway right now, Brittany. They are moving their entire pathetic lives permanently into my beautiful house without my permission." Brittany violently ripped her arm away from his tight grip, hot tears of pure, overwhelming frustration streaming heavily down her flushed cheeks. "Where exactly did you expect them to go, Derek?" she screamed back, her shrill voice cracking severely under the immense crushing pressure. "They completely lost their apartment lease in Ohio last month. You specifically promised me this massive house would be completely ours by this Friday morning. You explicitly promised me your senile father would be permanently locked away in that horrible facility, and we would instantly have all of his money to support my family. Now I have 50 starving people loudly complaining in my kitchen, a completely frozen turkey, and a disabled credit card that I cannot even use to buy a simple bag of ice. You need to fix this massive nightmare right now before my parents realize we are completely broke." Derek backed away from her, rubbing his temples in utter profound distress. "I am trying, Brittany," he groaned miserably, his voice shaking. "The lawyer said the judge absolutely has to review the medical documents before he signs the final conservatorship order. We just have to survive this one single day. Just feed them the cheap potatoes and keep them completely away from the front windows." I sat back in my comfortable chair, a cold, ruthless smile forming on my face. They were so entirely consumed by their own internal chaos and desperate lies that they failed to realize they were already completely trapped. I pulled my mobile phone from my coat pocket, the cool glass screen resting comfortably against my palm. As a seasoned structural engineer, I had always believed that a house should be as intelligent as the person who designed it. Over a decade ago, long before such technology became a standard luxury, I had painstakingly installed a highly sophisticated commercial-grade smart grid system throughout the entire estate. It was originally designed to automatically manage the immense energy consumption of the property, optimizing the central heating and regulating the deep water wells during the brutal Texas droughts. I had complete overriding digital access to every single mechanical artery flowing through the walls of that house. Derek, in his endless arrogance, had completely forgotten about the system, simply assuming the customized control panels in the basement were outdated relics of my past. He never once bothered to understand the foundation he was standing on. I opened the encrypted application on my phone, watching the digital blueprint of my estate materialize on the screen. The interface displayed the live energy output in glowing green metrics. The massive double ovens in the kitchen were currently drawing peak voltage, working desperately to thaw and roast those two pathetic generic turkeys. The master bathroom shower was running at full capacity, no doubt servicing Richard or Patricia as they made themselves entirely at home in my personal sanctuary. I watched the green lines pulse with electricity and water representing the lifeblood of their massive parasitic gathering. It was exactly 11:25 in the morning. I poured myself another cup of black coffee from the motel lobby thermos, taking a slow, appreciative sip. I wanted to wait for the exact perfect moment when their stress levels were stretched to the absolute maximum breaking point. At precisely 11:30, I placed my coffee cup down on the cheap laminate desk and leaned forward. I selected the primary water valve control on my screen. With a single deliberate swipe of my index finger, I initiated a total manual override. Miles away, buried deep beneath the front lawn, the heavy mechanized steel valve rotated firmly into the closed position, completely severing the estate from the municipal water supply. I did not stop there. I immediately navigated to the main electrical breaker tab. I bypassed the secondary safety warnings confirming my overriding authorization and tapped the master kill switch. Instantly, the glowing green lines on my digital blueprint vanished, replaced by a stark, absolute blackness. To ensure their complete and total misery, I accessed the separate climate control grid. Texas, in late November, could be brutally unpredictable, and today was particularly frigid with a sharp, biting wind sweeping across the hill country. I disabled the entire heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, locking the digital thermostats so they could not be manually rebooted from inside the house. With 3 simple taps on a piece of glass, I had effectively plunged 50 loud, demanding invaders back into the dark ages. I shifted my attention back to the grid of security cameras on my laptop monitor. The visual results of my digital strike were absolutely instantaneous and completely spectacular. In the massive kitchen, the bright overhead recessed lighting abruptly died, casting the crowded room into deep, heavy shadows. The digital displays on the double ovens went entirely blank. The gentle, continuous hum of the heavy refrigerator ceased completely. For 3 seconds, there was a profound, confused silence across the entire estate as the sudden blackout registered. Then the absolute chaos erupted. Brittany let out a shrill, piercing scream of pure frustration, violently slamming her plastic cutting board against the marble island. Her aunt, who had been loudly criticizing the cheap boxed stuffing, tripped in the sudden darkness and sent a glass bowl shattering across the hardwood floor. In the master suite, I watched through the infrared camera feed as Richard stumbled out of the bathroom, wrapped only in a towel, aggressively shouting that the shower had suddenly lost all water pressure and died mid-lather. The situation deteriorated with beautiful mathematical precision. Without electricity, the massive, partially frozen turkeys sitting in the dead ovens immediately became useless, rotting pieces of raw meat. Without water, the 6 bathrooms spread across the estate quickly became massive liabilities for a crowd of 50 people. I watched as the panicked relatives began wandering aimlessly through the dark, cooling hallways, their voices overlapping in a rising crescendo of anger, confusion, and relentless complaining. Young children started crying because the televisions and internet routers had simultaneously died. The older relatives started shivering aggressively, pulling their heavy winter coats back on as the sharp, biting chill of the autumn morning rapidly seeped through the large, unheated glass windows. Brittany was standing in the center of the dark kitchen, pulling at her frizzy blonde hair, looking like a terrified woman standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. Derek was frantically flipping the light switches up and down, completely unable to comprehend the massive systemic failure. He sprinted toward the basement to check the main breaker panels entirely. Unaware that the remote digital lockout rendered his physical efforts completely useless. Suddenly, the bright screen of my mobile phone lit up on the desk next to my laptop. The caller identification displayed the name of my son in bold, frantic letters. He was calling me. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the sweet, intoxicating melody of his absolute desperation. On the 4th ring, I slowly slid my finger across the glass and accepted the call. I tapped the speakerphone icon and set the device down gently on the desk, ensuring my voice would be broadcast with crystal clear precision. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone perfectly smooth, deeply calm, and entirely devoid of any emotional inflection. Dad Derek screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking violently under the immense crushing weight of his monumental failure. The background noise on his end was absolutely deafening. I could clearly hear Brittany sobbing hysterically and several heavy male voices shouting angrily about the broken plumbing. "Dad, where the hell are you right now? The power just completely went out across the entire house. The water is totally gone. The heat is dead. Everything is completely shut down, and I have 50 people screaming at me in the dark." I checked the basement breakers, but the main electrical panel is flashing some kind of weird digital lock code. I cannot get anything to reset. You have to tell me the override password right now. The turkeys are sitting in dead ovens, Dad. The entire Thanksgiving dinner is completely ruined. I leaned back in my stiff motel chair, interlacing my fingers and resting them on my lap. I watched him on the basement camera feed, pacing frantically in the dark shadows, holding his phone to his ear, with trembling, sweaty hands. I allowed a long, heavy, agonizing silence to stretch across the cellular connection, letting him fully marinate in his own spectacular destruction. Finally, I leaned close to the microphone. "What is wrong, son?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper that cut cleanly through his chaotic background noise. "Is the house simply too big for you to handle?" There was a sharp, sudden gasp on the other end of the line. Derek stopped pacing in the basement, his entire body going completely rigid, as the horrific reality of my words slowly registered in his panicked brain. "You did this," he breathed out, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of sheer terror and sudden dawning comprehension. "You turned everything off. Turn it back on right now, Dad. I am not playing games with you. You cannot do this to us on Thanksgiving. Brittany family is going to absolutely murder me." I let out a soft, dry chuckle that held absolutely no warmth or paternal affection. "I am not playing games either, Derek. You desperately wanted the responsibilities of being the master of the estate. You wanted the Grand Master Suite. You wanted to host 50 people on your own dime. Well, congratulations, son. You are now officially hosting them. But you are doing it completely in the dark, without a single drop of running water, and without a single shred of my charity to save you. Enjoy the raw turkey." Before he could scream another frantic threat or beg for mercy, I calmly tapped the red button on my screen, ending the call instantly. I immediately blocked his phone number, tossing the device aside. I looked back at the camera feeds. The house was a total disaster zone, a dark, freezing box filled with angry, betrayed guests, turning ruthlessly against their failed hosts. The structural demolition was proceeding exactly according to my architectural design, but the true masterstroke was yet to come. The massive power outage was merely the opening act. The main event was currently driving down the highway, heavily armed with legal documents and toxic gas, ready to clear the site permanently. Earlier that morning, I had checked out of the motel and joined Martin in his SUV parked discreetly just down the street from my estate. Sitting in the passenger seat, I kept my eyes fixed on the live camera feed on my laptop monitor as the digital clock slowly ticked toward 12 o'clock in the afternoon. The atmosphere inside my home had degraded from panicked confusion into sheer hostile tribalism. Without power or water, the 50 relatives from Ohio had begun turning on Derek and Brittany. Richard was standing in the dark living room, aggressively waving his arms, demanding to know why a supposedly wealthy tech entrepreneur could not even keep the basic utilities running on Thanksgiving Day. Brittany was sobbing loudly on the sweeping staircase, completely overwhelmed by the crushing humiliation. Derek was frantically dialing his phone again, presumably trying to reach the municipal utility company, completely oblivious to the fact that his current nightmare was entirely manufactured by my own hand. But their domestic squabbles were about to become entirely irrelevant. Through the hidden microphone installed on the front porch, I heard the faint, high-pitched wail of approaching sirens echoing down the long suburban street. The sound grew rapidly louder, sharper, and significantly more aggressive, cutting cleanly through the crisp, completely still autumn air. I watched the exterior driveway camera feed with immense satisfaction. 3 marked county sheriff cruisers turned sharply onto my property, their tires crunching heavily over the cobblestones. Their bright red and blue emergency lights flashed violently, casting urgent, sweeping reflections across the wide front windows of the dark house. The sudden, overwhelming police presence caused an immediate, absolutely stunned silence to fall over the 50 terrified people trapped inside. The angry shouting ceased instantly as they realized the authorities had arrived at their doorstep. Their foolish, completely arrogant illusions of a perfect holiday were completely and permanently shattered. Right behind the line of marked police cruisers, the true heavy machinery of my carefully engineered demolition finally arrived. 2 massive, bright yellow industrial commercial trucks rumbled slowly up the long driveway, their heavy diesel engines vibrating the cold ground beneath them. They parked in a tight, precise diagonal formation, aggressively blocking the remaining fleet of Ohio minivans from escaping the property. The sides of the massive trucks were painted with stark, highly visible black lettering that read Texas Biohazard Fumigation Services. Bold, terrifying warning symbols depicting bright red skulls and crossbones were plastered across the heavy steel doors. A highly trained crew of 8 men stepped out of the vehicles. They were dressed from head to toe in thick, heavy-duty protective chemical suits, wearing thick rubber gloves and carrying heavy canvas bags filled with thick rolls of bright yellow hazard tape. They moved with the swift, coordinated precision of a military unit, securing a highly dangerous combat zone. They immediately began unrolling massive, heavy vinyl fumigation tents onto the front lawn, preparing to completely envelop the entire sprawling residential structure. The sheer, overwhelming visual impact of the biohazard trucks and the chemical suits caused absolute, unadulterated panic to erupt inside the house. Relatives began screaming in pure terror, pressing their faces against the cold window panes, desperately trying to comprehend why a tactical hazmat team was currently surrounding their intended new home. They pushed against the glass like trapped animals, realizing the cage had just been permanently locked from the outside. There was absolutely no way out of this nightmare for them. As the heavy extermination crew began securing the primary perimeter, with bright yellow caution tape, Martin shifted his sleek, heavily tinted black luxury SUV into drive, and we pulled smoothly into the driveway, gliding to a graceful halt just behind the line of flashing police cruisers. My ruthless estate lawyer shifted the powerful vehicle into park and gave me a sharp, confident nod. It was my designated cue to enter the stage. I stepped out of the vehicle, planting my polished leather shoes firmly onto the cobblestone driveway. I was no longer wearing the oversized, worn-out cardigans or the scuffed orthopedic slippers of a frail, declining old man waiting for his final days in a terrible nursing home. I was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy silk tie. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders were squared, and my expression was entirely devoid of any weakness or confusion. I looked exactly like the commanding, highly successful structural engineer who had built this multi-million-dollar estate from the ground up 40 years ago. I walked toward the front of the house with a slow, powerful, and deliberate stride. The sheriff deputies stood near the heavy oak front doors, their hands resting cautiously on their dark leather duty belts, quietly waiting for my explicit direction. I approached the lead officer, a stern-looking man with graying hair, and gave him a polite, respectful nod of acknowledgement. "I am William Harrison." I stated clearly, my voice carrying the steady, resonant authority of a man in absolute control of his own territory. "This is my private property, and these people currently standing inside my walls are trespassing." Before the sheriff could even begin to formulate a proper verbal response to my statement, the heavy front doors of the estate burst violently open. Derek charged out onto the wide stone porch, his face flushed a deep mottled shade of angry purple, his eyes wide with sheer unhinged fury. Brittany stumbled out right behind him, clutching her phone to her chest, followed closely by a massive crowd of highly confused, terrified relatives from Ohio. Derek stopped dead at the top of the concrete steps, staring down at me in absolute, utter disbelief. He looked closely at my sharp, tailored suit, my confident, upright posture, and the heavy police presence flanking my sides. His treacherous brain simply could not process the impossible physical transformation standing directly before him. "Dad," he screamed out loud, his voice cracking wildly as he aggressively pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "What the hell is going on out here? Why are there biohazard trucks parked on my front lawn?" He turned his desperate, frantic gaze toward the lead sheriff deputy. "Officer, you need to arrest this man right now. He is my father, but he is currently suffering from severe advanced dementia. He just intentionally cut off the main power and the water supply to the entire house, and he is actively trying to ruin our family holiday. He is completely unstable and dangerous." Derek was panting heavily, sweat pouring down his face as he desperately tried to maintain his fabricated narrative of my mental incompetence in front of the authorities. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or distress. I simply stood my ground, looking up at my treacherous son with the cold, unyielding precision of an architect. Watching a poorly constructed, highly unstable building finally begin to collapse under its own miserable, crushing weight. He believed he held all the power, completely blind to the inescapable reality that I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of his fraudulent scheme. The grand finale had officially commenced, and there was absolutely no escape for him. It was time for him to pay the ultimate price. I stepped calmly past my furious son, completely ignoring his frantic, high-pitched screaming. I walked directly up to the lead sheriff deputy, reaching into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, legally certified manila folder and handed it politely to the officer. Inside this folder, you will find a fully executed court-approved 30-day notice of eviction. I explained, my voice echoing clearly across the tense, frozen driveway. You will also find the signed municipal hazard permits for an industrial-grade toxic fumigation scheduled to commence on this property at exactly noon today. The sheriff took the heavy folder, his seasoned eyes scanning the official county seals and the bold judicial signatures. He looked up at Derek, who was still aggressively pointing his finger at me, completely unhinged. Sir Derek yelled, taking a step toward the officer. "Do not listen to a single word this crazy old man says. He is completely senile. He is entirely out of his mind. You need to handcuff him right now before he hurts someone." The lead sheriff deputy did not reach for his heavy metal handcuffs. Instead, he slowly closed the manila folder and looked at Derek with an expression of profound, exhausted irritation. Mr. Harrison, the deputy, said, his deep voice projecting loud enough for the entire crowd of 50 terrified relatives to hear clearly. "This eviction paperwork is perfectly legal and entirely binding. The holding company that owns this estate officially terminated your residency 30 days ago. Furthermore, there is a licensed biohazard extermination crew standing right behind me, currently mixing a highly lethal sulfuryl fluoride gas." The deputy checked his heavy wristwatch with a stern, unyielding expression. "You and every single person currently standing on this private property have exactly 15 minutes to completely vacate the premises. If you are still standing on this grass when that 15-minute timer expires, you will all be placed under immediate physical arrest for criminal trespassing." A massive collective gasp swept through the large crowd of Ohio relatives. Brittany let out a weak, pathetic squeak, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in absolute horror. Derek's face morphed from angry purple to a sickening, chalky white. He shook his head frantically, digging wildly into the pockets of his wrinkled trousers. "No, that is impossible," Derek stammered, pulling out a crumpled, folded piece of legal paper. He waved it desperately in the crisp autumn air. "I have a court-ordered medical conservatorship. The judge signed it just this morning. I am his sole legal guardian. I have total control over his entire estate and all his financial assets. I am officially the absolute master of this house." Before the sheriff could even respond to this pathetic display, Martin Bradley stepped smoothly forward from the sleek black SUV. My ruthless estate lawyer walked with the predatory grace of a hungry shark smelling fresh blood in the water. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked at Derek with a chilling, deeply amused smile. He pulled a pristine white envelope from his briefcase and extended it toward my trembling son. "You are the master of absolutely nothing, kid," Martin said, his voice dropping to a lethally calm register. He forced the white envelope into Derek's shaking hand. "That house does not belong to your father. It never belonged to your father. Exactly 15 years ago, the entire estate was legally transferred into an irrevocable blind trust, owned entirely by a private corporate holding company. You could hold 1,000 medical conservatorships, and you still would not have the legal authority to claim a single blade of grass on this property. You spent your last remaining dime trying to steal an empty vault." Derek stared at Martin, his eyes darting frantically from the tall lawyer to the towering brick mansion. His treacherous brain violently short-circuiting as the absolute reality of his epic failure finally crushed him to his core. But Martin was not finished. He took a slow, deliberate step closer to my broken son. Furthermore, Martin continued, his voice echoing like a final nail being hammered into a wooden coffin. My legal team formally submitted your fraudulent medical evaluation to the State Medical Licensing Board yesterday afternoon. The corrupt concierge doctor you hired to fabricate your father's dementia diagnosis was arrested by state investigators at his private clinic at exactly 8:00 this morning. I is currently sitting in a cold holding cell, heavily facing multiple felony charges for medical fraud and criminal conspiracy. And he is already talking to the authorities about your exact involvement in the scheme. I highly suggest you save whatever breath you have left to call a very good criminal defense attorney. The piece of crumpled legal paper slipped entirely from Derek's paralyzed fingers, fluttering weakly to the cold cobblestone driveway. He dropped heavily to his knees, his physical strength completely evaporating as the massive, invisible weight of his impending federal prison sentence slammed into his shoulders. Behind him, the true social carnage finally began. The 50 relatives from Ohio had listened to every single word of the brutal exchange. The horrifying truth hit them like a runaway freight train. There was no massive family estate. There was no immense wealth to support them. Brittany and Derek had completely lied to them, luring them across the country to participate in a criminal takeover that had just failed spectacularly. The shock quickly mutated into a vicious, unforgiving mob mentality. Richard, who just hours ago had been arrogantly measuring my backyard for a guest house, turned on his daughter with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You lied to us," Richard roared, his face turning an angry, vibrant shade of crimson. "You dragged our entire family down here and made us give up our apartment leases for a house you do not even own. You are a complete fraud, Brittany." Patricia began sobbing hysterically, screaming at her daughter for ruining their lives. The crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins erupted into a deafening chorus of furious shouts and vicious insults. They completely abandoned their fallen hosts, turning their aggressive attention towards saving whatever meager possessions they had brought. The manicured front lawn transformed into a pathetic, chaotic scramble. Relatives began sprinting back into the dark, freezing house, dragging their heavy mattresses and cheap cardboard boxes back out through the front doors. They shoved violently past Derek, completely ignoring him as he knelt weeping on the hard cobblestones. They threw their belongings into the backs of their minivans and moving trucks, fighting with each other over trunk space in their rush to flee the premises before the toxic gas was released. Brittany stood alone on the large stone porch, utterly paralyzed by the profound, crushing humiliation of being publicly exposed and immediately abandoned by her own blood. She tried to reach out to her mother, crying desperately for help, but Patricia aggressively slapped her hand away, climbing into a minivan and slamming the heavy door firmly shut. The toxic gas was not even deployed yet, but the greedy parasites were already fleeing the structure in absolute humiliating terror. The demolition was fully complete. I stood silently near the sleek black sport utility vehicle, watching the massive yellow moving trucks and battered minivans disappear down the long suburban street. They sped away with reckless desperation, leaving behind a thick cloud of white dust that slowly settled over the cold cobblestones. The front yard, which just an hour ago had been swarming with loud, arrogant invaders, was now completely desolate. The only remaining activity belonged to the highly disciplined crew of the Biohazard Extermination Company. The men in their heavy chemical suits moved with mechanical efficiency. They hauled massive rolls of thick, brightly colored fumigation canvas across the manicured lawn. I watched as they began hoisting the heavy material over the tall brick chimneys, methodically wrapping my beautiful 40-year-old estate in a stark, terrifying yellow shroud. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. The house that Catherine and I had built, the very foundation we had poured our hearts into, was being sealed off to be pumped full of lethal gas. It was a harsh, necessary purification. The toxic parasites had to be eradicated so the core structure could finally breathe again. Down by the edge of the municipal sidewalk, far beyond the yellow caution tape marking the hazardous perimeter. Two solitary figures remained. Derek and Brittany stood shivering in the biting November wind. They had been entirely abandoned by the fleeing relatives. In the frantic, chaotic scramble to escape the incoming authorities, they had only managed to drag a single scuffed rolling suitcase out of the front door. All of their expensive designer clothing, their high-end electronics, and their carefully curated modern art pieces were now locked inside the house, about to be soaked in industrial poison. Brittany wrapped her thin cardigan tightly around her shoulders, her face buried in her chest as she wept uncontrollably. She looked absolutely nothing like the cruel, confident woman who had casually thrown away my late wife porcelain vases. Derek stared blankly at the massive yellow tents swallowing the mansion. Then his hollow eyes shifted toward me. He took a hesitant, trembling step forward. His pride, his overwhelming arrogance, and his smug sense of absolute superiority had been entirely pulverized. He walked slowly across the driveway, his expensive leather shoes scraping heavily against the rough stone. When he reached the edge of the black vehicle, his legs simply gave out beneath him. My son collapsed to his knees on the hard, unforgiving concrete. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his hands clasped together in a pathetic, desperate gesture of surrender. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a miserable, high-pitched sob. "You cannot do this to us. Where are we supposed to go? We have absolutely nothing left. We have no money, no credit, and no place to sleep tonight. Please, you have to stop this. We are your family." I looked down at the weeping man kneeling on the cold pavement. I searched my heart for a flicker of paternal sympathy, looking for the familiar ache of a father wanting to protect his vulnerable child. I found absolutely nothing but quiet, sterile emptiness. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had proudly sent to college, had died a long time ago. The creature kneeling before me was merely a greedy opportunist who had worn my son's face as a convenient mask. He dared to use the word family as a final desperate weapon, hoping to strike a lingering nerve of guilt deep within my conscience. He genuinely believed that the biological tie of blood would automatically grant him an infinite, unconditional pardon for his horrific crimes. He expected me to cave, to reach out my hand, and to pull him back into the comfortable safety of my protection. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow a single trace of anger to seep into my tone. My response was delivered with the cold, measured precision of a steel blade slicing through a rotten wooden beam. Family does not try to lock their father in a psychiatric asylum to steal his foundation. I said, my words falling over him like heavy stones. You did not look at me and see a father to love. You looked at me and saw an obstacle to demolish. You sat in my living room and happily paid a corrupt doctor to falsely declare me insane. You wanted me heavily medicated and permanently locked inside a miserable care facility for the rest of my natural life, just so you could have the master bedroom. Derek flinched violently, physically recoiling from the brutal, undeniable truth of his own actions. He opened his mouth to formulate a pathetic excuse, but his voice completely failed him. The crushing realization that I had known his entire sickening plan all along finally settled deeply into his panicked brain. He looked back at Brittany, who was still crying miserably on the distant sidewalk, clutching their single battered suitcase. She did not even have the courage to look me in the eye. "You dug this massive hole with your own 2 hands, Derek." I continued, my voice remaining devastatingly calm and perfectly level. "You spent 3 years draining my resources, disrespecting your mother memory, and actively plotting my absolute destruction. You gambled your entire existence on a fraudulent scheme, and you spectacularly lost. I have legally protected my legacy from your parasitic greed. You are no longer my responsibility. Enjoy sleeping in your car, Derek. I hear the back seat is very spacious." I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back on him, completely severing the invisible thread that had bound us together for his entire life. I opened the heavy passenger door of the sleek black sport utility vehicle and climbed smoothly into the luxurious leather seat. Martin Bradley sat quietly behind the steering wheel, his hands resting lightly on the leather rim. He gave me a brief, respectful nod of professional solidarity, fully understanding the monumental gravity of the moment. He shifted the powerful vehicle into drive and gently pressed the accelerator. I stared straight ahead through the clear windshield as the heavy car rolled smoothly down the cobblestone driveway. I did not look back at the kneeling figure of my son. I did not look back at the crying woman on the sidewalk. I did not even look back at the massive yellow tents slowly swallowing the grand estate I had built 4 decades ago. The past was permanently sealed behind a thick wall of toxic gas and legal concrete. As the dark vehicle turned onto the main suburban road, picking up speed and leaving the chaotic disaster zone completely behind. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp autumn air. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for 3 miserable years was entirely gone. I was finally absolutely free. I leaned my head against the soft leather headrest and closed my tired eyes for a brief, peaceful moment. The future was completely mine again. 6 full months have passed since the massive yellow fumigation tents completely enveloped my Texas estate. The toxic gas pumped into the walls of that house effectively eradicated the physical pests, but the legal mechanisms I deployed that afternoon successfully exterminated the human parasites, trying to destroy my life. Sitting in the quiet aftermath of that chaotic Thanksgiving morning, I allowed my ruthless estate lawyer to take complete control of the demolition cleanup. Martin Bradley executed his duties with the cold, mechanical precision of a military drone strike. He did not simply push my treacherous son out the front door. He systematically dismantled Derek and Brittany's entire existence, leaving them buried so deeply under a mountain of legal and financial ruin that they will never successfully dig themselves out. The legal avalanche began the very next morning. The State Medical Licensing Board, armed with the undeniable evidence Martin submitted, completely revoked the medical license of the corrupt concierge doctor they had hired. Facing the terrifying prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence for severe medical fraud and criminal conspiracy, the disgraced physician immediately panicked. He aggressively turned on his co-conspirators, eagerly accepting a strict plea deal in exchange for his full, unconditional cooperation with the authorities. He handed the federal investigators every single text message, every recorded phone call, and every digital bank transfer, proving that Derek had intentionally paid him to fabricate my severe dementia diagnosis. The overwhelming mountain of irrefutable evidence triggered a massive criminal indictment. Derek and Brittany were formally charged with multiple severe felonies, including attempted elder abuse, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy to commit grand financial theft. The sheer crushing weight of their impending criminal trials violently fractured their already fragile marriage. Without my endless retirement money to fund their lavish lifestyle, and facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in mandatory legal defense fees, their toxic relationship completely imploded. They turned on each other like starving wolves locked in a tiny cage. During their preliminary court hearings, they aggressively pointed fingers, loudly accusing one another of masterminding the entire horrific plot. The severe stress caused a deeply bitter, highly publicized divorce. They are currently drowning in an endless ocean of insurmountable legal debt. Derek was forced to declare total catastrophic bankruptcy. Ironically, the very same boy who arrogantly demanded that I sleep on a deflated air mattress in a cold garage is currently sleeping on a stained second-hand couch in a tiny, depressing studio apartment on the rough side of town. Brittany is facing similar financial devastation, forced to work double shifts at a miserable retail job just to afford her mounting legal penalties. The social fallout was equally spectacular. The 50 loud, obnoxious relatives from Ohio, who had been completely humiliated and abruptly rendered homeless on the front lawn, that Thanksgiving morning entirely severed all ties with Brittany. Richard and Patricia, her deeply arrogant parents, who had foolishly measured my backyard for their own personal guest house, were forced to beg for emergency financial assistance from their distant cousins just to afford the long drive back north. They are completely ostracized from their local community, permanently branded as greedy frauds who eagerly participated in a failed criminal takeover of an elderly man estate. They have absolutely no money, no property, and absolutely no family willing to speak to them. The demolition I engineered was absolute and completely merciless, with the toxic elements permanently removed from my life. I instructed Martin to initiate the final phase of my strategic architectural plan. The blind trust that legally owned the Austin property formally listed the sprawling estate on the open real estate market. Thanks to the massive structural upgrades I had personally designed over the decades, the heavy brick mansion sold within 2 weeks to a wealthy corporate investor for millions of dollars above the original asking price. The immense financial capital was securely transferred into my heavily guarded, diversified portfolio accounts. I was completely liquid, entirely debt-free, and totally unburdened by the heavy, lingering memories of a house that had been permanently tainted by such profound betrayal. I packed my most cherished belongings, including the beautiful antique porcelain vases that I had secretly rescued and hidden from Brittany, destructive grasp, and left the sweltering Texas heat behind forever. I wanted a fresh foundation built on solid, unbreakable bedrock. I found my ultimate sanctuary in the rugged, breathtaking mountains of western Montana. I purchased a stunning, custom-built modern cabin nestled deep within a dense, quiet forest of towering pine trees. The architectural design of my new home is an absolute masterpiece of structural engineering. It features massive exposed heavy timber beams, reinforced dark steel support pillars, and towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows that look out over the pristine, crystal-clear waters of a vast alpine lake. There are no noisy neighbors. There is no chaotic city traffic. There is only the deep, profound, and healing silence of the wild mountain landscape. Right now, I am sitting comfortably on my expansive wooden deck, feeling the crisp, refreshing mountain breeze against my face. The setting sun is painting the sky in brilliant shades of deep orange and crushed violet. I am holding a heavy crystal glass filled with 20-year-old perfectly aged bourbon. The golden liquid burns smoothly down my throat, warming my chest with an incredibly satisfying heat. Spread out on the sturdy wooden table in front of me is a massive, crisp sheet of architectural drafting paper. I hold a sharp graphite pencil in my steady hand. I am sketching a highly complex, beautiful new structural design, not because I need the money, and not because I have a demanding client. I am drawing simply for the pure, unadulterated joy of creation. I am a completely free, incredibly wealthy, and entirely independent man. My mind is sharp, my hands are steady, and my heart is at absolute impenetrable peace. I take another slow, appreciative sip of my bourbon, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue. I breathe in the sharp, clean scent of the surrounding evergreen forest, completely untainted by the smog and noise of my previous life. I often think about Catherine when I look out across the glassy surface of the mountain lake. I know with absolute certainty that she would be profoundly proud of the difficult choices I made to protect our legacy. She always deeply valued strength, honesty, and the fierce preservation of our personal dignity. We built a beautiful life together, and when that life was viciously threatened by the very child we raised, I did not allow our shared history to be degraded or stolen. I defended our foundation with everything I had. The deep, agonizing pain of my son's ultimate betrayal will always remain a small, quiet scar on my heart, but it no longer controls my daily existence. I successfully engineered a beautiful new chapter for myself. My days belong to me, shaped only by the quiet rhythm of the mountains and the steady, comforting logic of my architectural designs. I am the sole architect of my own destiny, and the structure I reside in now is built to last an eternity. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit you. I spent my life building a foundation to protect my family, only to realize the biggest threat to my structure was the sun living under my roof. When you discover that the people you love are plotting your demise, do not cry and do not confront them blindly. Step back, diagnose the weakness, and engineer a collapse so precise that they bury themselves under the weight of their greed. True strength is not just about building things up. It is knowing exactly when to let the wrecking ball swing. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your peace and sanity? Tell me your story in the comments below. If my Thanksgiving revenge satisfied you, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Stay strong, protect your foundation, and I will see you soon.